Accountability Office's report on duplication, fragmentation, and overlap in federal programs. Led by Comptroller General Jean Dodaro, the Government Accountability Office, or GAO, is a critical partner in this subcommittee's work to save taxpayer dollars and improve government services for the American people. This annual report identifies ways to save taxpayer dollars through more efficient and effective management. The report is a roadmap for agencies and Congress to make common sense reforms, increase coordination, improve program outcomes, and exercise fiscal responsibility. Since 2011, congressional and executive actions to implement GAO recommendations have resulted in $667 billion in cost savings and other financial benefits for the government and taxpayers. This includes more than $71 billion in the past year alone. I look forward to hearing from Comptroller General Dodaro and our GAO subject matter experts about this year's recommendations for improving government performance. I'm committed to working in a bipartisan way to eliminate duplication, overlap, and fragmentation to save taxpayer dollars and improve outcomes for the American people. And I look forward to continuing to work with Ranking Member Romney and my other colleagues to review these recommendations and develop ways to implement them. Thank you, Mr. Dodaro and your team, for testifying today. I look forward to our discussion and continuing our collaboration on these issues. With that, I'll recognize Ranking Member Romney for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair Hassan. Appreciate the chance to have this hearing. And Mr. Dodaro, appreciate your willingness to continue to serve after all the years. Greatly value your expertise and your commitment to our government and to our country. I simply can't imagine what it's like having your job and the job of your colleagues. Somehow, the image that comes to mind is a honeybee coming to a mountain meadow filled with flowers. It's like, how do I begin? How do I start? There's so much waste, fraud and abuse, duplication, fragmentation. It's like, where do I begin? And I salute you for finding many places to begin and making the recommendations you have. I'm cognizant of the many items that you have recommended in the past that remain open from various agencies, but also of the many areas that actually have resulted in savings having occurred. I also would note that as a result of last year's duplication report that you presented here, I introduced, along with Chairman Peters, the Bipartisan Government Spending Oversight Act, which has made it through committee. I'd like to see it get to the floor. I appreciate your support for that legislation and hope that we finally get it done. I also am concerned about the ability to maintain a strong and effective workforce at the federal government level. Given the telework policies that we have, the figures we're seeing for vacancies in government buildings give me some concern, wonder whether we're really getting the productivity from our employees that we hope to do. Earlier this month, my colleague Senator Manchin and I introduced legislation to ensure that federal agencies are operating effectively by placing reasonable limits on the use of employee teleworking. I'd like to get your perspectives on that. But today, we come to hear your report and hopefully to once again fashion legislation that will promote the ideas you bring forth, as well as create a bit of a hot seat under the individuals responsible for managing our federal government. With that, Madam Chair, turn the microphone back to you.
Thank you very much, Senator Romney. So it is the practice of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee to swear in witnesses. So if you'll please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you give before this subcommittee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. Please be seated. The subcommittee is pleased to welcome back Comptroller General Jean Dodaro. Mr. Dodaro began his career at GAO more than 45 years ago, and he has led the agency for the last 13 years. In this position, he oversees GAO's important work, which leads to hundreds of reports, testimonies, and recommendations issued each year. Mr. Dodaro is widely considered one of the government's foremost experts on government administration, efficiency, and effectiveness. Today, Mr. Dodaro is assisted by Kathleen Barrick, Jessica Lucas-Judy, Mark Gaffigan, and Nick Marinos. Mr. Dodaro, you are recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chair Hassan, Ranking Member Senator Romney. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this year's report about improving government efficiency and effectiveness. I also want to commend both of you for your persistence in helping us get these recommendations implemented throughout government. It's making a difference, and I appreciate that very much. This year, I'm pleased to report, in prior years, we've made over 2,000 recommendations. 73% have been fully or partially implemented. And as Chair Hassan noted, that's resulted in $667 billion in financial benefits already. Senator Romney, you mentioned open recommendations yet. There's tens of billions of additional dollars that can be saved by implementing our open recommendations. And I'll mention that in my statement today. This year's report, we have over 100 new recommendations in 42 different areas. Now, importantly, these recommendations will provide suggestions to strengthen the federal government's efforts to ensure public safety, to strengthen consumer protection, and also our national security areas. For example, we made recommendations to improve tsunami warnings, to improve the National Wildlife Disease Surveillance Program, particularly for those diseases that are potentially transmittable to humans over time. We have recommendations to improve federal efforts to combat child trafficking. We have recommendations to improve biosurveillance activities to protect the public, and also efforts to better manage the effects of wildfire smoke, which has been growing with the more and more wildfires across the country. Also, we have recommendations to close regulatory gaps and improve fragmentation in regulations of platforms that trade crypto assets and in stable coins as well. There are recommendations to improve how the federal government protects federal research projects from foreign threats, and also efforts to enhance cybersecurity threat sharing information, particularly in critical infrastructure areas, which I've been very, very concerned about in those areas. Also at DOD, we've made recommendations there to deal with improving fragmentation and overlap in their over 700 medical facilities and how they manage those facilities. They've transferred them from the services to a central defense health agency, but it's still not complete, and there's a lot of opportunities for streamlining and improvement. Also in research on service members' fatigue. This is a serious problem. It's a problem across DOD. It's led to deaths, accidents, tremendous loss of equipment. It's a serious issue. And also we found they can improve their efforts in wargaming. They're really not benefiting from all the information they collect. It's very fragmented across the department. Also at IRS, we have a number of suggestions so that they could become more effective in their audits of large partnerships, high wealth, high income individuals, and sole proprietors. In all of those areas, there are too many audits being targeted that don't result in any additional income being charged. And so they're, basically taking time up from people who are already paying their fair share in the taxes and not effectively targeting non-compliance areas. Now, in terms of the open recommendations, we have 76 open matters before the Congress. I'm very pleased in the last Congress and this Congress, 42% have had legislation introduced to implement those matters that we've had, and both of you have been very active in that regard, and again, I appreciate it. But there's also, I'll give you two areas of other ones where there's big dollars. One is Congress needs to reauthorize FirstNet, which is the first responder network. That's due to expire in 2027. If Congress doesn't do that, we would forego the ability to collect over $15 billion to pay for that network going forward. Also, if Congress would pass legislation to equalize Medicare payments based upon site neutrality, CBO estimates that would save $141 over a 10-year period. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. Look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you so much. I'll start with a round of questions and then turn it to Senator Romney. Mr. Dodaro, improving program management can, as you've pointed out, improve the health and safety of the American people. This year's report highlights the ways in which FEMA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the Federal Communications Commission can better collaborate, for instance, to alert the public to tsunami threats, as you mentioned, in the United States. It also discusses how the Department of Defense could improve its research on whether service members are getting enough sleep, which can improve the military's assessment of and response to service member fatigue, so that the Department of Defense can better protect our men and women in uniform. And I appreciated you highlighting that in your opening remarks as well. Another recommendation discusses how the Environmental Protection Agency can better manage public health risks associated with wildfire smoke. So how can agencies better prioritize the annual report's recommendations that have a direct impact on the health and safety of the American people? For example, do agencies need to identify leaders to spearhead implementation or shift financial resources towards these goals?
Yeah, first, I think the agencies need to have accountability for implementing our recommendations. I'm pleased with some of the responses that we received. For example, in the tsunami warnings area, NOAA has a system, but their system only alerts people using wireless networks, and they use the NOAA weather radio alerts. But there are gaps in that system. But FEMA has a system for national alerts that can also use radio, television, and cable networks. But NOAA cannot connect technically, for technical reasons, to use also the FEMA system. So we said, have you ever sat down with FEMA and FCC to try to work this out? And the answer was no. So we said, you need to get together and work it out. So we've directed our recommendations to accountable officials. We're going to follow up and make sure in all these areas these recommendations get implemented.
Well, I would look forward to more suggestions from you and your team about ways that we really can incentivize and steer agencies towards these kinds of priorities. They save us money, they also save lives, and they improve the quality of life and service for the American people. One of the things that I learned as governor was the importance of coordination and sharing information, both internally and across agencies. It sounds like something so obvious to do, but it is sometimes very hard to actually get people to do it. So several recommendations in this year's report relate to better information sharing within agencies or between stakeholders, as you've just talked about, to improve efficiency. For example, GAO recommends that the Department of Homeland Security assess how it facilitates sharing cybersecurity threat information between law enforcement and critical infrastructure sectors to better prepare for and prevent cyber attacks. This includes sharing threat information with healthcare facilities and hospitals that face cyber attacks, like the attack on the United Health Group that significantly affected New Hampshire hospitals and providers all across the country. In another example, GAO found that better information sharing between scientists on federal biomedical research committees could reduce the risk of duplicative research and, as a result, save taxpayer dollars. What are some of the common challenges associated with information sharing in the federal government? Are there statutory barriers to better information sharing and coordination that we could address in Congress?
One of the things that Congress could do is we've developed over time 8 different factors that result in successful collaboration among entities. One is clear definition of goals, roles and responsibilities, written statements, an estimate of the resources needed, and progress reports, accountability. A lot of it's Management 101, but we evaluate these efforts against this collaboration criteria, and routinely we find the federal efforts are short of fulfilling these criteria. If Congress could mandate these collaboration criteria be used, many times Congress creates interagency committees and others, and that's a very good step and much needed because the agencies may be not getting together on their own. But if you could also say for every statutorily required interagency committee, they must follow these collaboration practices and demonstrate that they have, you would have a much better outcomes across the government.
All right, thank you. That's very helpful. I want to turn to acquisitions and asset management for a minute. The U.S. government is one of the largest buyers of goods and services in the world. Improving the ways in which the federal government buys and uses goods, services, and real estate can save taxpayer dollars and lead to better services for the American people. For example, GAO recommends that the Department of Homeland Security improve its oversight for purchasing what it identifies as major assets. Under their definition, anything costing $300 million or more. An example of a major asset is the Transportation Security Administration's $1.7 billion contract to modernize airport X-ray screening equipment. Improving this oversight for these large assets could save the federal government hundreds of millions of dollars each year while ensuring that the department has what it needs to keep our country safe, secure, and free. Can you discuss how smarter buying practices can lead to better services and ultimately save taxpayer dollars?
Yes, we've recommended many years ago that there be what's called category management, where the federal government could leverage its buying power, where it buys common goods,
Right.
but instead of each individual agencies negotiating their own contracts, have more master contracts. And of the $667 billion that's been saved through our implementation of our recommendations, I'd say between at least 50 to 100 million of that have come from better purchasing efforts. But much more could be saved. This is still an untapped area, and we're encouraging OMB to work with the agencies, set more aggressive targets, cover more areas, and to get better results.
Okay, one little follow-up, and then I'll turn to Senator Romney, and I'll probably come back to this topic again. But the oversight practices that you just talked about, how can they apply to smaller assets, things less than $300 million? Because obviously, $300 million is a lot of money.
Right, right. Well, there's separate issues. The category management can cover all sorts of items, from common email services, computers, whatever. I mean, it doesn't just apply to large dollar items.
Okay.
So it can be effective no matter what you're purchasing, and any common items.
Thank you. Senator Romney.
I'm going to yield to my colleague and let Senator Scott
Okay.
take the microphone.
Thank you, Senator Romney. Thank both of you for hosting this, and thank you for caring about how our federal government spends money. So, Mr. Dodaro, thank you for what you do. You've got a great team, and I've been up here 5 years, and your reports are really helpful. So you guys do a great job, and thanks for being responsive. I think everybody up here could say that about you, so thanks a lot. Back in 2020, I requested GAO do a study on OPM regarding the Federal Employee Health Benefit Program. It was revealed that OPM mismanagement of the FEHB program allowed ineligible individuals to obtain employer-sponsored health insurance at the hefty price tag of approximately $1 billion in taxpayer dollars every year. $1 billion, I mean, that's a hell of a lot of money. I appreciate the GAO report on this, which found that OPM has never reviewed their enrollees, failed to include the impact of ineligible members in OPM's annual risk assessment, and that OPM should identify and remove ineligible family members from the program. This is not something unique to the federal government. When I was governor of Florida, we did the same thing. We did review, and we saved millions upon millions of dollars. When I was in the private sector, we did it, I think, every year, because if you run a big company, there's a lot of money to be saved because people take advantage of these programs. So 25 states have done similar audits, including California, Texas, and New York. For these reasons, I recently introduced the FEHB Protection Act with Senator Carper, and fortunately it passed the Homeland Security Committee today. So we believe this common sense bill will both save federal taxpayer dollars and preserve the FEHB for eligible beneficiaries, which is what it's supposed to do. So my first question is, what is the scope of improper payments that GAO believes is happening in FEHB?
Yeah, well, we haven't made our own estimate. The estimates by OPM and the OPMIG, importantly, range from $1 billion to $3 billion. So it's a lot of money. We just did our first ever estimate of fraud across federal government federal spending programs between 2018 and 2022. And we estimate fraud losses of $233 billion to $521 billion annually during that period of time based upon the risk assessments. Obviously, the risk was higher during the COVID spending era as well. So fraud's a big problem. It's a problem here, and it could be easily addressed.
In addition to reforms going forward, how important is it to do a retrospective audit of the FEHP program?
It's absolutely essential if you want to ensure. I mean, the bulk of the enrollees are people who have been in the program for a number of years. And if you don't audit them, you're really missing a big opportunity to achieve potential savings.
Before you wrote the report, how focused was OPM on stopping ineligible individuals from getting on FEHP-B?
There was decades of inactivity in this area, so it wasn't focused on it very much at all.
In your subsequent discussions with OPM, how serious does OPM appear to be taking steps to reduce improper payments?
Yeah, they're saying the right things, and I think they're taking some tentative steps in the right direction. The acting director of OPM asked to see me. He came over and explained what they're doing. So they're saying the right things, but they're still not planning this retroactive audit full-time because the records are all in the individual agencies. They don't have a central repository, which, you know, a lot of companies would have that, where you could easily audit that. But you could do some sampling and some other things. So there's efforts. They need to be a little bit bolder in their actions if they're really going to save the potential amount of money in this area. We'll continue to have discussions with them.
But you could do it agency by agency, just start.
You could do it, but they don't have a lot of authority to mandate it, you know, type of thing. That's part of the problem here. Yeah. You know, when you have these kind of activities where they're running the program, but they're relying on the cooperation of the agencies, and they don't have really that much authority to mandate that they do that. And they could use support from OMB if they wanted to go in that direction. And even sometimes OMB's hesitant to mandate these things, unfortunately.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Chair. Next again, Senator Romney.
Senator Romney.
Thank you. The 2024 GAO report highlights ongoing fraud in the Employee Retention Tax Credit Program. And the fraud was so extreme that the IRS basically said, okay, we're going to stop processing these claims. In your opinion, is the ERTC still a valid program? Has it outlived its usefulness? Should we basically say enough already for the ERTC?
Yeah, it's basically over, but they could still file amended returns over that period of time. I think that the program was a bit ill-fated from the beginning. There was confusion about it versus the Paycheck Protection Program and whether there'd be duplication. In 2022, we raised and made recommendations to IRS to better focus on compliance issues in this area, have a plan and document things. You know, fortunately, they've taken this action to put a pause in, but there's a lot of programs. So the program is in effect over, but the tax implications are going on for a little bit. IRS needs to focus on this, document it, and recover, you know, if they've overpaid in some of these areas, recover the money.
And I presume not continue to make new payments
Right.
going out under the program.
Right.
It ought to be eliminated.
Right. We're gonna continue to focus on it to make sure it's done right. I mentioned our fraud estimates, Senator Romney, on the program spending side. We're going to do one on the revenue side. You know, our estimate doesn't cover tax fraud. A lot of these tax credits have potential compliance problems with them. Earned income tax credit is one of the highest improper payments, up there with Medicare and Medicaid. We've pointed out problems in other tax credit issues in addition to just tax fraud on normal returns.
You know, the numbers on fraud, particularly as it relates to government fraud, are perpetuated against the government, are just mind-numbing. It's in the many billions of dollars, and we've been going after this for years. And I wonder, is there something we could do in general? I mean, for instance, if someone steals from a church, I feel the penalty ought to be greater than if they steal from, you know, the Walmart. Oh, maybe I'm going to get in trouble for saying that. But and maybe I shouldn't elevate the church that high. Let's just say, but if someone steals from the government, My view is, gosh, the penalties ought to be really quite extreme. One, we ought to have good systems for finding you so that people aren't tempted. And two, if we do find you, boy, you're really going to have the book thrown at you. My sense is that people figure, hey, I can steal from the government and nothing's going to happen, both because of lack of detection and because the penalty isn't severe enough. Should we be devoting more resources to identifying fraud, and then should we increase the penalties for people who basically steal for the government? And if so, where is a place to focus those kinds of efforts?
Yeah, and we have a number of recommendations in this area. It's a great question. First of all, I think the penalties are pretty severe, but the problem is that you have undetected fraud, which we're not focused on as much as we should be, and that's what our estimate includes, potential undetected fraud, to try to point in that direction. But I sat next to testifying before the House on Medicare and Medicaid programs. The Inspector General from HHS basically said they have 300 to 400 viable cases of fraud that they can't investigate because they don't have the resources. And then you have the statute of limitations. Now, on the PPP program, Congress extended it from 5 to 10 years. The administration's trying to extend it on the unemployment insurance area, which I support. That should go to 10 years too. So you need a little bit longer time, but then you need to give the IGs more ability to settle administratively. A lot of times they'll do this, but then it gets to the prosecution sort of funnel, and unless it's big dollar amounts, there's not enough resources to prosecute the people, even though the investigations might have been done. So not enough investigations are being done, not enough effort on prosecution. There ought to be more tools given to the Inspector Generals. I've also recommended that the current effort of the Pandemic Response Accountability Community, where as a group of IGs, they've developed 90 data sharing agreements, they've developed thousands of leads. That's due to expire in a couple years. It should continue on a permanent basis. I made this pitch back in 2015 when the Recovery Accountability Transparency Board was due to disappear, and Treasury had the ability to pick it up, but they didn't. I advised them to do it, and I advised Congress to make it permanent then. They didn't, so here we were 5 years later throwing trillions of dollars into pandemic relief. This group was not in existence. It didn't get recreated until 2021. By then, we'd already spent $2 trillion. So we ought to have it on a permanent basis. The scope of fraud and improper payments is such that it ought to be permanent.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Let Senator Langford.
Thank you. Gene, good to see you again. Thanks for all the work that you and your team do so much. What's interesting to me is you just finished up talking to Senator Romney about trying to be able to deal with that permanent area of oversight. That's actually, Senator Romney has that bill. I'm on that bill, and trying to be able to figure out how we're actually trying to be able to get that done long-term as well, because that is an area that we've got to be able to resolve in the days ahead. Let me, Senator Hassan, do I have permission to be able to, or authority or your blessing to be able to put some slides up on the screen?
Indeed you do.
I'll take that. Let me put a few things up on the screen here. Gene, you and I have talked for years about the taxpayer's right to know and the ability to be able to allow every taxpayer, and including all the taxpayers that sit on this dais as well, to be able to actually see the programs that are out there. As you know, the federal program inventory now, after years of work from both of us, that now exists in its infancy, and it has moved from a pilot program to a program that actually exists out there. So the federal program inventory, I've put a slide up there to be able to show everybody what it looks like. I would encourage folks to be able to go test this out for a test run to be able to show what it is. This particular slide is just the opening page of it to be able to see, just doing a program search on it, of about 4.47 trillion in obligations from 2022, 2,388 programs on it. We just asked it the question to be able to show some of the disaster relief programs and to be able to filter out how many disaster relief programs are there. They're in the list. There's 83 of those total across the federal government and all agencies, and listed out the $45 billion in obligations just in that area. And then you can drill down just in DHS programs to be able to ask it that question. Then you can drill down even more into each program. It gives you an outline of what that program does, and then drill down even more about how the obligations have worked over several years, where the trend line is on that. And then you can ask it a fun question that we don't ask enough is, that program exists, who authorized that? Where did it come from? What law actually connects to that? Which we've always felt is incredibly important, to not have programs that are out there that they can't figure out what statute actually authorizes that it's just somebody wanted to do it, so they created it. That's not how it's supposed to work. So all of these have to have their authorizing statute and then the actual results from it. Now, this is in its infancy, and as I mentioned before, there's about 2,300 programs there. Gene, are there more than 2,300 programs in all the federal government?
Yes.
Yes. So they've taken information that already exists in other places, and OMB has dropped that into this new federal program inventory, which is extremely helpful as a starting point. The data, the system, the usability of it has been helpful. So I want to just raise a couple of things just in this conversation. You've been tracking this, I know, a lot, as I have been, on how it's actually being rolled out and what it's being done. Are we in the pilot phase of this, or are we actually in the implementation phase of this? Because it has to be complete by 2027.
Right, right. We're still in the early stages, I think, of implementing it. The OMB's taken some good next steps. They're having the agencies track existing program laws and map them against the 2,300 programs and make sure they're all, it can be more complete. The first step is to make it more complete and make sure it tracks to all the programs. And there's alignment between what they have in there and all the different program activities. They've set some target dates for them to do this, the agencies, this summer and then by the fall timeframe. So that's a good first step. Right. There's also, the law also requires, as you well know, that in addition to the information you showed, there'd be a link to program evaluations on each of these programs, whether they're actually achieving the objectives that they say that they are, whether there could be, issues of improper payments, fraud, et cetera, et cetera. So that has to be done yet over time.
Is that done for any of the programs at this point?
I don't believe so.
I don't believe so either. Not that I've been able to see or we've been able to find on it.
Yeah.
The goal of this is, full well, the goal was the ability for members of Congress, watchdog groups, or just everyday taxpayers, if they wanted to ask a question, how many disaster programs are out there, to be able to pull down a list, see how much is spent, and then to evaluate it. Are they evaluated at all for their effectiveness, for their oversight? If they are evaluated, how? And which one's working, which one's not? This works really well in things like job training programs. We have a lot. Now, if you pull down job training programs in this, you don't get very many, because we know there's a lot of them that have actually not been added to the system. But we wanted to be able to know, where did that program come from? Is it working? How many employees are being set aside for that one? How much money is being allocated? How much money is actually getting to the end, or how much is being spent in the bureaucracy? This was a way to do a couple things. One is for agencies to be able to oversee themselves. So if they start a new program, they should be able to do a search to be able to determine, is someone else already doing this same thing? Right now, that can't be done, or it can only be done in its infancy to be able to determine that. The second thing is, Congress should be able to look at it and to say, before we pass a new law, to be able to quickly determine, is somebody already trying to do this same thing, that we can then say that either needs to be tweaked and fixed because it's a problem, or nothing exists, so we need to try to start it. And so we can actually take out duplication. We've all griped about duplication from this dais year after year. This gives us the opportunity to actually see duplication, set programs side by side, and figure out how they've been evaluated. But we're not complete on that yet.
Right, that's
And so
correct.
it's getting the rest of the data in. From your interactions with OMB, they've done a great job of getting this started. The big missing piece on this, internally on it, is data. The other one is the search feature. You've got to know the magic federal word to be able to search it. And if you don't put in the actual federal program name, you can't just put in general jobs training, something like that. That's not going to get you there. You've got to actually get the magic name that it's called by the agency to be able to search it. So we've got to be able to improve the search to be able to dig into that. How is OMB's commitment to this project that you've seen?
It's the best I've ever seen, and I've been following this, as you know, for a decade or more on this particular effort. You know, when we started overlap, duplication, fragmentation, the law, at your predecessor's request and put in a law, Senator Coburn, if we would have had something like this, we could have been done a lot faster. I mean, we had to go around and actually extract from the agencies that there were 140 housing programs, that there were 40-some job training programs. Only 4 have ever been evaluated. So it took a lot of digging and research. This tool would be terrific when it's done. It's also why I supported the Data Act, which is now 10 years in its running. The real important thing will be for OMB to get this complete initially, but then have a data governance structure to keep it updated going forward. It needs maintained. It would be a shame to have it built properly and then atrophy because of lack of interest. So they need to sustain their commitment over time. And I know GAO will.
Right. Well, the belief in this is once it's all set up and the data is in there the first time, it's easier to be able to maintain it, and every agency knows when you get the program up and going, you've got to also enter that data over there. But it also hopefully encourages every agency to say before you start a program to know you're going to have to evaluate it, you're going to have to show the statutory authority, and you probably should check and see if this already exists before you launch something.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Thank you.
I appreciate your interest and your support on this.
Well, this long-term, I think, has a real benefit to us to be able to get rid of a lot of duplication that we've all been chasing for a very long time.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you, Senator Langford, for your leadership. I've been glad to work with you on this, and I'm glad to kind of see some tangible evidence of the progress that we're making, and we still have a long way to go.
We have a little bit to go. May I ask unanimous consent to be able to add the slides that I showed everybody, actually put in the record?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Without objection. I have 3 additional questions, which I think are pretty quick ones, and then I think this is probably the extent of members who are going to be asking questions today. I wanted to follow up. We talked about purchasing practices. I wanted to follow up to talk a little bit more about recommendations that you made about better data on the use and maintenance needs of federal buildings. This data could help agencies decide when to downsize their footprint or invest in improvements, which could save hundreds of millions of dollars over the next decade, and inform how agencies manage their in-person workforce. What prevents agencies from being able to better manage their assets and making better buying decisions?
Well, there's not that many barriers. It takes a little bit of leadership. We recommended that OMB work with the agencies to come up with a utilization rate. Right now, the agencies are all doing it differently. Most of the utilization rates apply to headquarters buildings in Washington, not the buildings throughout the country and all the different assets. And you need different rates for like laboratories versus other kind of facilities. So it's not an easy job, but somebody needs to take leadership. You also can use more of these predictive models to deal with deferred maintenance. Deferred maintenance has increased quite a bit. We found of the 9 agencies we looked at, which are huge property holders, none of them were fully utilizing predictive modeling to say, okay, if I make an investment here, I can save this amount of money. Right. When's the best time to make that investment, et cetera. And so those are 2 suggestions that we made. You know, real property management's been on our high-risk list for a long, long time. Part of it was because of the underused nature of the building. I think there's been progress in the leasing area, but more could be done there too in light of the new working arrangements that agencies are kind of forging and working their way through.
Okay, thank you. I now want to turn to background check systems. This year's report identified 3 distinct challenges facing the National Background Investigation Service, which is run by the Department of Defense in collaboration with several other agencies. Can you talk a little bit about each of these challenges?
Yes. First, we've been looking at this system for a while now. Right. In 2021, we issued a report so they don't have an integrated schedule, right. You know, and so they don't know how long it's going to take. Then we looked at it in 2023, they still didn't have an integrated schedule, and we found that their cost estimates weren't complete. So we're a little frustrated, so we elevated that to a matter for Congress to direct DOD to have an integrated and cost schedule. So the system, now this system is supposed to replace eventually the systems that were in OPM right. back in 2015 when they had that breach of all the security information. Right. So here we are, we're coming up on a decade later, and we still don't have these new systems in place. Now, the other problems we identified is lack of reciprocity. You know, where one agency can do a security background check and another agency would accept that check. 2 problems there. One is the IT systems that contain the information that was done on the security check aren't complete.
Okay.
So we checked 31 different agencies. 28 said that the IT systems, when they check it from another agency, isn't complete. So they don't have all the information. And then there's a basic lack of trust here. You know, one agency doesn't trust another agency. And so those are the issues that we point out. This is, you know, on our high-risk list.
Yeah.
I'm also concerned, I just talked to OMB, I've talked to Director Haynes at the Office of DNI, Director of National Intelligence, and about they're slow to implement a lot of these recommendations. And so I had higher hopes that they'd be further along in this process, but they're not.
Thank you for that. And just to kind of follow up, you mentioned that the Department of Defense's efforts to fully implement the National Background Investigation Service Program are both behind schedule and they're over budget. GAO recommends that Congress require the Department of Defense to review the National Background Investigation Services Program and update its project schedule and cost estimates so we actually know what's going on. How could Congress's action here help get this program back on track?
Well, to force them to make some decisions and disclosures. You know, a lot of times there's this sort of mystical hope that this is all going to work out okay.
Yeah.
And I can here to assure you that it won't.
Yeah.
If you don't have a good schedule, you don't have cost estimates, it's not going to work out. It hasn't worked out for so far. They've been doing this for a number of years.
Yeah.
And so they need to be forced to come up with the schedule estimate. You know, we developed a best practice for how to do a schedule estimate and also how to do a cost estimate based on private sector best practices, government best practices, and we gave it to the agencies and said, here, follow this.
Right.
So we go in, it's like an open book test, all right? And we go in and say, okay, are you following this? No.
Okay.
Okay? Part here, part there, whatever. I mean, so it's, you know, because we can't audit every system in the government, so I try to give them self-help tools to do a better job in this area. You know, we have IT management and acquisition on a high-risk list across government.
Yeah.
I mean, this isn't the only, system that's having this type of problem. We routinely find it. So I think, you know, there needs to be more emphasis on Congress making them follow these best practices guides.
Okay.
Because if they follow these guides, you get a better outcome.
Yeah.
And you get it sooner and you get it cheaper. And
Okay, that's helpful. You referenced this in the answer you just gave, but I just want to give you a chance to say anything else that you wanted to about this. You talked about the reciprocal nature of these background checks and the needs for agencies to work together. As we think about agencies needing to work together and collaborate and depend on each other for information as we go forward, how can they avoid the challenges similar to ones that DOD is dealing with now when they're working on these large interagency programs?
you need to have good communication and good regular communication, and you need to have structure. There needs to be written agreements, and this gets back to those 8 collaboration criteria that I mentioned. If you follow those 8 criteria, you get a good outcome in the process. It sort of walks you through how to do a joint project together across government. And most things now require multiple agencies because of the complexity of the problems in our governance structure to work together. And so, I mean, we make a living at GAO pointing out where they're not working together very effectively. I wish we could give up this job and that they could do it right. But it just time after time, they're not doing it. I mean, it's varying degrees of effectiveness, but it could be done much better if they actually followed these best practices.
Okay, thank you for that. Last question for me. As Congress and federal agencies work to review and respond to the recommendations in this report, how can GAO assist us with prioritizing the recommendations that need most urgent attention?
Yes. Every year I send a letter to every department, agency head in the federal government and prioritize our open recommendations to them. And so we make those letters available to the Congress, so we could use that to develop a priority list for this committee. We've also have a list in this report of every area where we think you could save over $1 billion by implementing the recommendation. So that's a prioritized list on financial benefits and cost savings. And then there are other areas where we point out where, as you mentioned in your opening statement, there could be improvements to public safety. So I'd say the criteria ought to be, and we can help create a list for you, ones that would improve public safety, ones that would provide better consumer protections. I mean, this whole crypto asset stablecoin area needs regulatory attention, and also where there are dollar savings to be had. And we'll be happy to do that.
Thank you. Senator Romney.
I've got a couple of items, pretty broad items. I'm just going to begin with one that's more narrow, which is I begin by noting that the federal workforce is, in many cases, extremely productive, hardworking. I spoke with a family member of a federal employee just today, spoke about how their spouse is just working like crazy. On the other hand, concerned that some other people in the department are not working quite so hard, and all the burden is falling on the few rather than the many. And this revolved around the teleworking that we do following COVID. I mean, everybody went home, and interestingly, not everybody's come back to the office. Had the response time of consumer calls, people calling in either the IRS or calling in for information on labor, agriculture, and so forth, had the response time been the same as before COVID, fine. But in fact, the lines are longer. People are having a harder time getting in touch with the government. And so you wonder, how well is teleworking work for us, and do we need to oversee somehow in a better way, a more effective way, what happens when people are working from home? Do you have any sense of whether this is an issue we need to give consideration to?
Yes, we're looking at that issue right now across government and a number of different agencies. What effect has it had on customer service, on the agency achievement of its mission, and those sorts of things. On recruitment and retention, too, there's issues there. I'd say the focus Congress ought to put on this, in my opinion, is on outcomes, as you said. Are we getting the right outcomes that we want to achieve? And not try to micromanage how that happens, but if you don't get the right outcomes, you need to hold the agencies accountable. It may be that it's telework, or it may be they don't have the right people in the first place. They haven't trained them properly to answer the calls. They're not holding them accountable. And, you know, people aren't smarter just because they're sitting in a government building. I mean, you know, so, but I think it's outcome-oriented is really the way. That's the way I manage a GAO workforce. I said, you know, we get the right outcomes, you can have workplace flexibilities, but if we don't get the right outcomes, we're not going to do it. Fortunately for us, we study it and evaluate it, and our outcomes are really good. And it doesn't matter, you know, where people are. But we're in a knowledge agency. Plus, there are skill gaps across the government. Of the 37 high-risk areas, 26 or 5 are on there because they're critical skill gaps. Right now, there's struggle to get AI people, whatever. The government can't pay the same salaries, but you can give some workplace flexibility. You can get some high-tech talent, and we've been able to do that, GAO scientists, computer security people, by giving them some workplace flexibilities they can't get anywhere else, but you wouldn't have that caliber of talent in government in case you did that. So there needs to be flexibility depending on the mission. Now, some agencies need to have people there to deal with the public. They can't deal, you know, on a computer basis. But I think the way to approach this, and it would solve broader problems, is to focus on outcomes. You know, or what are your goals? Where are you short? What are you doing to make improvement, and to hold the agency officials accountable? You know, I'm up here all the time before Congress discussing shortcomings in the agencies. They're less up here defending what they're doing and telling Congress what they're going to do to fix some of the problems. So I think more oversight would be effective. I think you're right to be concerned about this, but the focus, in my opinion, ought to be on, are they achieving their missions? And if not, why not?
AI, you said the magic word that I want to talk about just briefly or get your perspectives on. It's going to be extraordinarily disruptive. It's going to be helpful, make us more productive. I would imagine much of what AI does is going to be focused on white-collar work. That's mostly what government does, is white-collar work. Will AI dramatically reduce the need for personnel, do you believe, in the federal government? Are there adjustments we're going to need to make to usher in the capacity and capability of AI? What's your perspective on where that's going to take us? I mean, I'm very optimistic about how it can make us more effective and more efficient. I'm also scared to death about things it can do inappropriately. I don't begin to believe we've thought about how to regulate it or manage it at all. But what are your perspectives on the advent of AI and the impact it's going to have?
Yeah, I think looking at it broadly, beyond the federal government, just for the country as a whole, I think it'll have enormous implications for the workforce, both in a positive and a negative way. And it could affect blue collar as well as white collar broadly across the government. You're right in terms of the government workforce. You know, we've done, since 2018, we've done 50 studies on AI. We've looked at AI in accelerating drug development, medical testing, diagnosis, and treatment on patients. We've looked at it as a result to the algorithms used for DNA testing, for example, and other things. And we developed a framework for how to audit artificial intelligence algorithms. In the government, I'm mostly concerned because, as we talked a little bit with Senator Langford, some of the data in the government is not good at all. It's not complete, it's not accurate, it's not reliable, and if it's used for AI applications, all you're going to get is bad outcomes faster. So the limitation of the government, because of the lack of reliable data, is enormous and should not be underestimated. Also, the federal government, you know, we've looked at the applications in DOD, as well as in civilian applications. The government's going to have difficulty getting people who are trained in AI, so we need education programs, we need better recruiting and training. You know, we're still short in computer security people, even though that's been a problem for decades now. And so I think it's going to have enormous implications. And not too far behind that, you're going to have quantum computing, which is going to completely destroy all the cryptography that we have as known events. So these changes are happening rapidly. Government always has a problem responding as fast as changing in the environment. And these science and technology changes are coming the fastest in human history. And so we got to keep up better in these areas. So you're right to be concerned about AI. It has potential benefits if managed properly. It can also have a dark side too, just like any other technology that could be used to perpetrate fraud in other areas. We've already seen some fraudsters, you know, using AI against the government. They're pretty more creative, and they have more flexibility than the government areas. But speaking on fraud, just one last point on that. We work with Congress. There's a Fraud Reduction and Data Analytics Act that implemented in 2016 GAO's framework for preventing fraud in the government. And agencies just haven't implemented it. And Congress hasn't held them accountable. And you know, one of the things they're supposed to do is do a fraud risk assessment of new programs. You know, when SBA did the first fraud assessment on the Paycheck Protection Program in February 2022, when the program was over, I mean, so they weren't ready. You know, that law was in place 4 years before the pandemic, and they didn't really, and many agencies didn't do it too. I don't mean to single them out alone. So that's another tool that I think Congress could use to help prevent fraud in the first place.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Chair?
Well, thank you, Senator Romney. Thank you, Senator Romney, and thank you again, Mr. Dodaro. As always, this is really, really helpful to you and your entire team. We thank you for your service and your work and your insights. Thank you to all of your agency for everything you do to improve government services for the American people. I look forward to continuing to work to address your recommendations to save taxpayer dollars and deliver better services to all Americans. The hearing record will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on May 30th for submissions of statements and questions for the record. With that, this hearing is adjourned.